Have you ever wondered what it would truly feel like to wake up in the middle of humanity's worst nightmare? Well, the answer isn't what you think it would be. Instead of the dramatic chaos you see in movies, the reality of finding yourself trapped in a plague-ridden town would be far more terrifying and psychologically devastating than any Hollywood production could capture. So in this chilling exploration through one of history's most feared scenarios, I'm going to reveal exactly what would happen to your mind, your body, and your chances of survival if you suddenly found yourself in the epicenter of a deadly epidemic. This isn't some fictional zombie apocalypse or exaggerated movie plot. This is based on real historical accounts, medical research, and psychological studies of what actually happens when plague strikes a community. What I'm going to do is walk you through every horrifying detail of this experience, from the moment you open your eyes to the desperate decisions you'd face in your fight for survival. By the end of this series, you'll understand exactly why plague-ridden towns throughout history became places where humanity's darkest instincts emerged, and how even the strongest people were broken by circumstances beyond their comprehension. But first, let me paint you the picture of what you'd actually encounter, because the reality is far more disturbing than anything your imagination could conjure. The year could be any time in human history. Plague doesn't discriminate based on era, technology, or social progress. Whether it's the Black Death of medieval Europe, the cholera outbreaks of the 19th century, or even modern epidemics, the fundamental human experience remains horrifyingly consistent. You wake up in what appears to be an ordinary bedroom, sunlight filtering through dusty windows, birds chirping outside. Everything seems normal until you notice the silence. Not peaceful silence, but the kind of oppressive quiet that settles over places where life has been systematically extinguished. The absence of human activity is so complete, it becomes a presence unto itself, pressing against your consciousness like a weight you can't shake. Your first instinct might be confusion, perhaps assuming you've overslept or that it's simply an unusually quiet morning. But as you move toward the window, the true scope of your situation begins to reveal itself in ways that will fundamentally alter your understanding of human vulnerability. The streets below aren't empty because people are sleeping or working indoors. They're empty because most of the people who once filled them are dead. The visual evidence of plague's presence isn't immediately obvious from a distance. Towns don't transform overnight into the apocalyptic wastelands depicted in popular culture. Instead, the horror reveals itself gradually, through small details that accumulate into an overwhelming realization of catastrophe. Doors that should be opening for morning routines remain closed. Windows that should show signs of life behind them stare back like vacant eyes. As you venture outside, the first thing that strikes you isn't the sight of bodies or obvious destruction. It's the smell. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, but there are certain odors that bypass our conscious defenses and trigger immediate, visceral responses rooted in millions of years of evolutionary survival instincts. The smell of mass death is one of these primal triggers, and it would hit you before you'd taken a dozen steps from whatever building provided your temporary shelter. The psychological impact of this olfactory assault cannot be overstated. Your brain would immediately begin processing information that contradicts everything your conscious mind wants to believe about your situation. The rational part of your thinking would search for alternative explanations. Perhaps there's been some kind of industrial accident. Maybe a sewer system has failed. Anything other than accepting the horrible truth that you're surrounded by human decomposition on a scale that indicates systematic population collapse. But denial can only sustain itself for so long when confronted with mounting evidence. The next wave of realization would come through sound, or rather, the absence of sounds that human settlements produce constantly. No conversations drifting from nearby buildings, no footsteps on cobblestones or pavement, no doors opening and closing, no wheels turning or animals being tended. The acoustic signature of a living community is so fundamental to human experience that its absence creates a form of sensory deprivation that can trigger panic responses, even in psychologically stable individuals. Your mind would begin racing through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Natural disaster seems unlikely given the intact buildings and undisturbed infrastructure. War might explain some aspects of the abandonment, but wars leave different kinds of evidence. The realization that you're dealing with disease would probably emerge gradually as you began to notice the specific patterns that epidemic death creates in human communities. The first bodies you'd encounter wouldn't be the dramatic scenes of people who died in the streets that movies love to portray. Instead, you'd find evidence of people who died in their beds, in their homes, surrounded by family members who had also succumbed. Plague doesn't kill randomly. It follows predictable patterns based on transmission methods, incubation periods, and the progression of symptoms that create distinctive signatures in how communities are affected. Houses would contain entire families who died within days or weeks of each other. The staging of these scenes would tell stories of desperate attempts at care, of people who stayed to tend their loved ones despite knowing they were exposing themselves to fatal illness. Makeshift quarantine measures that proved inadequate. Stockpiles of food and water that were gathered by people who understood they might need to isolate themselves, but underestimated how quickly their situation would deteriorate. The psychological terror of discovering these domestic scenes of mass death would be compounded by their intimacy. These weren't anonymous casualties of some distant catastrophe. These were people who had lived lives remarkably similar to your own, who had faced the same impossible choices you were now confronting, who had possessed the same hopes for survival that were currently sustaining your own denial about the severity of your situation. As you moved through the town, patterns would emerge that revealed the epidemic's progression and the community's response to it. Certain areas would show evidence of attempted quarantine measures. Barricades made from furniture and household items. Buildings marked with symbols that warned of infection within. These markings would represent some authorities' attempt to contain the spread, efforts that had obviously failed given the current state of complete abandonment. Other sections would reveal signs of social breakdown that occurred as the epidemic overwhelmed the community's ability to maintain order and basic services. Broken windows and damaged buildings that indicated looting or riots. Abandoned carts and wagons suggesting failed attempts at evacuation. Evidence of fires that had been allowed to burn unchecked, either because there weren't enough healthy people left to fight them, or because survivors had deliberately set them in desperate attempts to cleanse infected areas. The most disturbing discoveries would be the signs of how quickly civilized behavior had deteriorated once people realized their situation was hopeless. Human beings can endure remarkable hardships when they believe survival is possible, but the combination of certain death and social collapse creates conditions where moral constraints that normally govern behavior simply evaporate. You'd find evidence of desperate attempts to hoard resources, homes where people had barricaded themselves with stockpiles of food and water, only to die anyway when the disease found them despite their precautions. Businesses that had been stripped bare by people who no longer respected property rights because property rights had become meaningless in a community where there was no longer any authority to enforce them. The religious buildings would tell their own stories of how faith communities had responded to catastrophe. Some would show evidence of having been used as makeshift hospitals or refugee centers, with bedding and medical supplies arranged in ways that suggested organized attempts to care for the sick. Others would reveal signs of desperate religious ceremonies, perhaps attempts to appease divine wrath or seek supernatural intervention when medical solutions proved inadequate. But the most psychologically damaging discoveries would be the evidence of how individuals had spent their final days once they realized death was inevitable. Personal belongings arranged in ways that suggested people had tried to create some dignity or meaning in their last moments. Letters or journals left behind by people who wanted some record of their experience to survive even if they couldn't. Final messages written on walls or doors by people who hoped someone might eventually find them and understand what had happened. These intimate glimpses into the final thoughts and actions of the dead would force you to confront the reality that you were now facing exactly the same choices they had faced. The same impossible decisions about whether to flee or shelter in place, whether to try to help others, or focus solely on self-preservation, whether to maintain hope for rescue or accept that you were probably going to die in this place. The weight of this realization would trigger the first major psychological crisis of your experience. The abstract knowledge that you were in danger would transform into visceral understanding that you were probably going to die, and that your death would likely follow the same pattern as the hundreds or thousands of deaths that surrounded you. This moment of recognition represents a fundamental shift in consciousness that separates ordinary fear from existential terror. Your survival instincts would begin operating at levels of intensity that most people never experience outside of immediate physical threats. Every decision would carry life or death implications that required you to process information and make choices faster than human beings are normally equipped to handle. The cognitive load of trying to assess risks, identify resources, plan escape routes, and maintain psychological stability simultaneously would push your mental capacity beyond its normal limits. The isolation would compound every other aspect of the horror you were experiencing. Human beings are social creatures whose psychological stability depends partly on contact with others of their species. The complete absence of other living people would create a form of sensory deprivation that could trigger hallucinations, paranoia, and breakdown of reality testing even in mentally healthy individuals. But the most terrifying aspect of your situation wouldn't be the immediate threat to your physical survival. It would be the gradual realization of how quickly and completely normal human society had collapsed when faced with this particular type of crisis. Everything that seemed permanent and reliable about civilization had proven to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The infrastructure that supported daily life had simply stopped functioning when there weren't enough healthy people left to maintain it. The social institutions that provided order and security had dissolved when their personnel became casualties. The economic systems that distributed resources had broken down when there weren't enough participants left to make them viable. This recognition would force you to understand that your own survival couldn't depend on any of the systems or relationships that had previously provided security and meaning in your life. You would be truly alone in ways that few human beings in modern society ever experience, facing challenges that would test every assumption you'd ever made about your own capabilities and moral boundaries. The immediate practical challenges of survival would begin asserting themselves within hours of your awakening, transforming abstract terror into concrete problems that demanded immediate solutions. Your body's basic needs wouldn't pause to accommodate the psychological trauma of your situation, and the intersection of physical necessity with environmental contamination would create dilemmas that no amount of preparation could have anticipated. Water would become your first critical concern, but not in the way survival guides typically address hydration needs. Every source of water in a plague-stricken community becomes potentially lethal, contaminated either directly through diseased bodies or indirectly through the breakdown of sanitation systems that normally keep drinking water separate from human waste. The wells that served the community might contain corpses of people who fell in while drawing water during their final illness, or who were deliberately thrown in by survivors, trying to poison the water supply to prevent enemy forces from using it. Municipal water systems, if they existed in your particular time period, would have failed days or weeks ago when there weren't enough healthy workers left to maintain pumping stations and treatment facilities. Rivers and streams that flowed through the settlement would be contaminated with runoff from areas where bodies had been improperly disposed of, or where overwhelmed residents had simply given up on sanitation practices that required more energy than dying people could muster. The psychological pressure of needing water while knowing that every available source might kill you would create a form of cognitive torture that would dominate your thoughts and decision-making processes. You'd find yourself staring at wells and streams, calculating odds that your rational mind couldn't actually compute, weighing certain dehydration death against probable infection death, knowing that either choice might doom you, but that avoiding the choice entirely definitely would. Food presents similar but more complex challenges because starvation takes longer than dehydration, giving you more time to make increasingly desperate decisions about acceptable risks. The homes and businesses around you would contain stockpiles of preserved foods that their former owners had gathered during the early stages of the epidemic, when people still believed they might outlast the crisis through careful preparation and resource management. But accessing these supplies would require you to enter spaces where people had died of infectious disease, handling objects they had touched during their illness, breathing air that might still carry dangerous pathogens. Every meal would become a calculated gamble between immediate survival needs and long-term infection risks, with no reliable information to guide your decisions because the people who might have learned through trial and error were all dead. The preserved foods you'd find would tell their own stories about the epidemic's progression and the community's response to it. Root cellars packed with vegetables that were never eaten because entire families died before winter ended. Smokehouses full of meat that was carefully prepared by people who didn't live long enough to consume it. Granaries that were sealed and hidden by communities that hoped to preserve seed grain for replanting, only to have everyone who knew the locations die before the information could be passed on. Your exploration of these food sources would provide increasingly disturbing insights into how the epidemic had unfolded and how people had spent their final weeks. Some stockpiles would show evidence of careful rationing, with supplies divided into small portions that suggested people had tried to make their resources last as long as possible. Others would reveal signs of panic consumption, where people had apparently abandoned long-term planning and consumed everything available as quickly as possible, either because they realized death was inevitable or because social order had broken down to the point where hoarding was impossible. The clothing and personal belongings scattered throughout the town would present their own categories of survival decisions, complicated by contamination concerns. Your own clothes would eventually become inadequate for whatever weather conditions you faced, and the abundant supplies of clothing left behind by the dead would seem like obvious solutions until you considered that these garments had been worn by people during their final illness, potentially carrying infectious agents that could survive for extended periods in fabric fibers. Yet exposure to the elements might kill you faster than disease transmission, forcing you to weigh immediate environmental threats against possible future infection. The psychological impact of wearing dead people's clothes would add another layer of trauma to decisions that were already pushing your mental capacity beyond its limits. Every time you put on a shirt or coat that had belonged to someone who died of plague, you'd be reminded that you were following the same path they had followed, making the same choices they had made, with probably the same ultimate outcome awaiting you. Shelter decisions would prove equally fraught with impossible choices between competing risks. The buildings around you offered protection from weather and potential concealment from any other survivors who might view you as a threat or resource to be exploited. But these same structures were contaminated with the presence of death, filled with air that had circulated around diseased bodies, surfaces that had been touched by infected hands, spaces where people had coughed and bled and died in ways that left invisible traces of whatever had killed them. The houses that seemed most attractive for shelter purposes would often be those where entire families had died together, meaning they contained the most contamination, but also the most resources and the least evidence of violent struggle. Buildings that appeared to have been abandoned early in the epidemic might be safer from infection, but would have been stripped of useful supplies by later waves of desperate survivors. Your sleep, when exhaustion finally overcame terror and vigilance, would be haunted not just by nightmares about your situation, but by the immediate physical presence of death surrounding you. The sounds that buildings make at night would take on sinister significance, when you couldn't be certain whether creaking floorboards indicated settling wood or approaching footsteps of other survivors who might not have friendly intentions. The darkness would amplify every fear and uncertainty about your situation, transforming ordinary night sounds into potential threats that kept you in a state of hypervigilance that prevented restorative rest. Your sleep deprivation would compound all the other stresses you were facing, degrading your judgment and decision-making capabilities at exactly the moment when clear thinking was most essential for survival. Weather would become a far more serious threat than you'd ever experienced in normal circumstances, because your ability to respond to changing conditions would be severely limited by contamination concerns and resource constraints. Rain that might normally be welcomed as a source of fresh water would instead represent potential exposure to runoff contaminated with disease agents, while also threatening to flood areas where you'd stored supplies or compromise whatever shelter arrangements you'd managed to establish. Cold temperatures would force you to make increasingly dangerous choices about fuel for heating, potentially burning contaminated materials that released infectious agents into the air you breathed, or accepting hypothermia risks that weakened your immune system's ability to fight off whatever diseases you'd inevitably be exposed to regardless of your precautions. The complete breakdown of medical care would transform minor injuries and illnesses that would normally be trivial inconveniences into potentially life-threatening emergencies. A simple cut that became infected could kill you just as surely as plague, because there would be no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, no medical professionals to provide treatment that could prevent complications. Your own body would become both your most important asset and your greatest source of anxiety, as you monitored every sensation for signs that you might have contracted whatever disease had killed everyone around you. The incubation period for most epidemic diseases means that you could be infected and contagious for days or weeks before showing symptoms, making every decision about resource gathering and shelter seeking into potential death sentences that wouldn't reveal their consequences until it was far too late to change course. The psychological torture of waiting for symptoms to appear would be intensified by your detailed knowledge of how the disease had progressed in its previous victims. The evidence surrounding you would provide graphic illustrations of what you could expect if infection occurred, removing any comfort that might come from uncertainty about your potential fate. Every headache would seem like the beginning of fever. Every muscle ache would feel like the onset of the weakness that had preceded death in so many others. Every irregularity in breathing or digestion would trigger panic about whether your body was beginning the process of shutting down that you'd witnessed in the arrangement of corpses throughout the community. The isolation would begin affecting your mental stability in ways that went far beyond simple loneliness, creating distortions in perception and judgment that could prove as dangerous as any physical threat you faced. Human beings require social interaction for psychological calibration, using conversations and shared experiences to maintain accurate understanding of reality and appropriate emotional responses to circumstances. Without other people to provide feedback and perspective, your thoughts would begin following patterns that might seem logical internally, but were actually symptoms of developing mental illness brought on by extreme stress and sensory deprivation. You might begin talking to yourself, or to imagined companions, or to the corpses you encountered. Not because you believed they could respond, but because the human need for communication would demand some outlet, even when rational expression was impossible. The decision-making processes that had served you well in normal circumstances would prove inadequate for the types of choices you now faced, because conventional moral and practical frameworks assumed the existence of society, law enforcement, medical care, and future consequences that no longer applied to your situation. Every ethical principle you'd been taught would be tested by circumstances where following traditional moral guidelines might result in your death, while abandoning them might be necessary for survival but would fundamentally change who you were as a person. These moral dilemmas would intensify as your resources dwindled and your desperation increased, forcing you to consider actions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances, but which might represent your only remaining options for staying alive in an environment where all the usual rules of civilized behavior had become not just irrelevant, but potentially fatal to follow. The question of whether to remain in the town or attempt to flee would dominate much of your strategic thinking, but both options would carry such enormous risks that rational analysis would provide no clear guidance for decision-making. Staying meant accepting continued exposure to contamination and depleting resources, but leaving meant venturing into unknown territory where conditions might be even worse, while carrying minimal supplies and no knowledge of safe destinations or travel routes. The geography surrounding your plague-stricken town would present a maze of potential escape routes, each carrying its own catalogue of deadly uncertainties that would make leaving feel almost as dangerous as staying. Rivers that might provide navigation routes could be contaminated with runoff from other affected settlements upstream. Roads that appeared to lead towards safety might actually connect to regions where the epidemic was still actively spreading, transforming your escape attempt into a journey directly into the heart of ongoing contagion. Mountain passes that seemed to offer isolation from infected populations would present their own lethal challenges in the form of exposure, wild animals, and terrain that could kill you through accident or exhaustion long before disease had the chance. Coastal routes might promise access to ships or boats, but maritime escape would require nautical knowledge you probably didn't possess. While coastal communities were often the first places where seaborne epidemics established their initial footholds, your lack of detailed geographical knowledge about the surrounding region would compound every aspect of travel planning, because the maps and local guides that would normally help navigate unfamiliar territory were either unavailable or potentially contaminated with the same infectious agents that had killed their previous owners. The landmarks that residents used for navigation might be invisible to outsiders, while the seasonal patterns of weather and resource availability that determined safe travel timing would be mysteries that could prove fatal to guess incorrectly. The decision about what supplies to carry would involve impossible calculations about weight versus necessity, with every additional item potentially meaning the difference between having essential resources and being too burdened to travel effectively. Water containers would be absolutely necessary but remarkably heavy, especially when you couldn't be certain about finding safe refill sources along whatever route you chose. Food supplies would face similar weight restrictions, complicated by spoilage concerns and the reality that preserved foods suitable for travel might not provide adequate nutrition for the physical demands of cross-country movement. Weapons for hunting or self-defense would seem essential given the complete absence of law enforcement and the possibility of encountering other desperate survivors. But most effective weapons were heavy and required ammunition or maintenance supplies that would consume precious carrying capacity. The psychological comfort of being armed might justify the weight penalty, but actually using weapons would require skills that most people didn't possess and would create noise that might attract unwanted attention from whatever threats existed in the surrounding wilderness. Clothing appropriate for extended outdoor travel would need to balance protection from weather and vegetation against mobility requirements and contamination concerns, while also considering that you might need to abandon or replace garments if they became too damaged or dirty to continue wearing. The boots or shoes that seemed adequate for short-distance movement around town might prove completely inadequate for long-distance hiking over varied terrain, but the sturdy footwear left behind by the dead might not fit properly, or might carry infection risks that outweighed their practical benefits. Medical supplies would seem crucial for treating injuries or illnesses that might occur during travel, but most useful medications would have been consumed or would have expired during the epidemic, leaving you with supplies of uncertain potency and effectiveness. Bandages and basic first aid materials might be available, but without proper antiseptics or antibiotics, even minor wounds could become infected in ways that would end your journey prematurely. The psychological preparation required for leaving everything familiar behind and venturing into completely unknown territory would prove almost as challenging as the physical preparations, because departure would mean abandoning any possibility of rescue by outside authorities, who might eventually arrive to investigate or provide assistance. As long as you remained in the town, there was always the theoretical possibility that help might arrive, however unlikely that seemed, given the evidence of complete abandonment. But once you left, you would be committing yourself to complete self-reliance in an environment where your survival skills would be tested against challenges that few people in modern society ever face. The comfort of familiar surroundings, even when those surroundings were contaminated with death, would be replaced by the constant uncertainty of never knowing what dangers might lie beyond the next hill or around the next bend in the road. The timing of your departure would involve weather considerations that could mean the difference between successful escape and death from exposure. But waiting for ideal conditions might mean remaining too long and depleting your strength or resources past the point where travel would be feasible. Early morning departures would provide maximum daylight for navigation and progress, but might also increase your visibility to any potential threats in the surrounding area. Night travel would offer concealment, but would dramatically increase the risks of becoming lost, injured by unseen obstacles, or falling victim to wild animals that were more active during darkness hours. The absence of artificial lighting that characterized normal human settlements would make navigation extremely difficult and dangerous, while the psychological stress of traveling through potentially hostile territory in complete darkness might prove more than your already strained mental state could handle. The question of following established roads versus cross-country travel would present trade-offs between easier navigation and increased exposure to other travelers who might represent threats rather than opportunities for mutual assistance. Roads would be faster and less physically demanding, but they would also be the routes that other survivors, bandits, or military forces would most likely use, creating possibilities for encounters that could prove dangerous or fatal. Cross-country routes would offer more concealment and might avoid areas of heaviest contamination, but would require navigation skills and physical conditioning that most people didn't possess, while also increasing exposure to natural hazards like rivers, cliffs, wild animals, and weather conditions that could prove lethal to travelers without proper equipment and experience. The supplies you encountered during your exploration of the town would need to be evaluated not just for their immediate utility, but for their potential value as trade goods if you encountered other survivors during your journey. Items that seemed worthless in your current situation might prove valuable to people with different needs or circumstances, while resources that appeared essential might be too bulky or heavy to justify carrying over long distances. Precious metals or jewelry might retain value for trading purposes, but would also represent weight that could be better used for food, water, or practical equipment. Written materials like maps, books, or technical manuals might prove invaluable for navigation or survival information, but would be vulnerable to weather damage and might become useless if they became wet or torn during travel. Tools and equipment left behind by craftsmen or professionals might provide capabilities for making repairs, constructing shelter, or obtaining food through hunting or fishing, but would require skills you might not possess and would add significantly to your carrying burden. The temptation to take everything that might prove useful would need to be balanced against the reality that excessive weight would slow your progress and increase your caloric requirements at a time when food supplies were already critically limited. The mental preparation for potentially encountering other survivors during your journey would require you to develop strategies for determining whether strangers represented opportunities for mutual assistance or threats to your safety and resources. Other people who had survived the epidemic might be allies who could share knowledge, resources, and protection, but they might equally be desperate individuals who would kill you for your supplies without hesitation. The social skills that served you well in normal circumstances might prove inadequate or even dangerous when dealing with people who had been traumatized by experiences similar to your own, and who might have abandoned conventional moral constraints in favor of pure survival instincts. Trust that developed too quickly could prove fatal if extended to people who were only pretending friendship until they could gain advantage over you. But excessive suspicion and hostility might cause you to miss opportunities for cooperation that could dramatically improve your survival prospects, while also creating unnecessary conflicts with people who might otherwise have been willing to help or at least leave you alone. The balance between appropriate caution and productive social engagement would require constant recalibration based on circumstances that changed unpredictably. Your physical condition would deteriorate steadily during any extended journey as inadequate nutrition, contaminated water, insufficient sleep, and constant stress took cumulative tolls on your strength, endurance, and immune system function. The gradual degradation of your capabilities would make each day of travel more difficult than the previous one, while simultaneously making you more vulnerable to injuries, illnesses, or attacks that you might have been able to handle earlier in your journey. The psychological effects of prolonged isolation and stress would compound the physical challenges, creating feedback loops where declining mental state contributed to poor decision-making that worsened your physical condition, which in turn further degraded your psychological stability. Hallucinations, paranoia, and depression would become increasingly likely as your journey continued, potentially causing you to make choices that seemed rational internally, but were actually symptoms of developing mental illness. The landscape itself would become an adversary that tested every aspect of your survival capabilities, from basic navigation and weather protection to food procurement and hazard avoidance. Terrain features that appeared manageable from a distance might prove impassable when approached, forcing detours that consumed time and energy you couldn't afford to waste. Water sources that seemed clean and safe might be contaminated with agricultural runoff, industrial pollutants, or biological agents that would cause illness or death days or weeks after consumption. The delayed effects of contamination would make it impossible to learn from mistakes, because symptoms might not appear until you were far from the source of contamination and unable to correlate cause and effect. Weather patterns would shift without warning, transforming manageable travel conditions into life-threatening emergencies that required immediate response with inadequate equipment and supplies. Sudden storms could leave you exposed to lightning, flooding, or temperature extremes that could kill you within hours, while extended periods of adverse weather could trap you in exposed positions where your limited supplies would be consumed faster than you could replenish them. The wildlife you encountered would represent both potential food sources and mortal threats, but distinguishing between the two would require knowledge that most people didn't possess about animal behavior, hunting techniques, and food preparation methods that could prevent illness from improperly handled meat. Predators that might normally avoid human contact could be more aggressive due to changes in their normal food supplies caused by the epidemic's effects on livestock and human settlements. Your journey would become a race against time where every delay brought you closer to complete physical and mental breakdown. But haste could lead to fatal mistakes in navigation, resource management, or hazard assessment that would end your escape attempt permanently. The pressure to make rapid progress would conflict with the need for careful planning and risk evaluation, creating a psychological tension that would strain your decision-making capabilities beyond their normal limits. The ultimate question of whether escape was even possible would remain unanswered until you either reached safety or died in the attempt, making every step forward an act of faith in possibilities that might not actually exist anywhere within the range of your available resources and remaining strength. The realization that escape might be impossible would gradually settle into your consciousness like a slow poison, but this recognition wouldn't bring the relief of certainty you might expect. Instead, it would create a new form of psychological torture where hope and despair alternated in cycles that prevented you from fully committing to either acceptance or continued struggle. During moments of clarity, you'd understand that the odds of successfully reaching safety were mathematically negligible, given your limited supplies, deteriorating physical condition, and complete ignorance about conditions in the surrounding territory. But human psychology isn't designed to accept certain death gracefully, and survival instincts would continue generating optimistic scenarios and escape plans, even when rational analysis demonstrated their futility. This internal conflict between reason and instinct would consume enormous mental energy that you needed for practical survival tasks, creating yet another layer of inefficiency in an already desperate situation. You'd find yourself spending precious time and cognitive resources planning elaborate escape routes that you knew were probably impossible, while simultaneously neglecting immediate needs like water purification or shelter maintenance that could extend your survival for days or weeks. The The concept of time itself would begin to distort under the psychological pressure of your situation. As the normal rhythms that regulate human consciousness disappeared along with the social structures that had previously provided temporal anchoring. Without clocks, scheduled activities, or social interactions to mark the passage of hours and days, your perception of duration would become unreliable in ways that complicated every aspect of survival planning. Minutes spent in terrified vigilance would feel like hours, while entire days of exhausted wandering might compress into memories that seem to last only moments. This temporal disorientation would make it increasingly difficult to track how long your supplies were supposed to last, when you'd last consumed water or food, or how much time you could afford to spend resting versus searching for resources. The disruption of normal sleep cycles would accelerate your psychological deterioration while simultaneously making you more vulnerable to the physical dangers that surrounded you. Fear would keep you awake when your body desperately needed rest, but exhaustion would cause you to fall asleep at inappropriate times and locations where exposure or discovery by threats could prove fatal. Your dreams, when they finally came, would blend memories of normal life with the horrors of your current situation in ways that made waking up increasingly disorienting. You might dream of family dinners or workplace conversations, only to wake up surrounded by corpses and contamination, creating jarring transitions that reinforced your psychological isolation and made maintaining emotional stability increasingly difficult. The absence of any other living human beings would begin affecting your sense of identity in profound ways, as the social interactions that normally reinforce our understanding of who we are simply vanished. Without conversations, shared activities, or social roles to maintain, your personality would start to feel fluid and uncertain, as if the fundamental aspects of your character required external validation to remain stable. You'd find yourself talking aloud to maintain some connection to language and communication, but these one-sided conversations would gradually take on qualities that might have seemed like signs of mental illness under normal circumstances. The boundary between internal thoughts and external speech would blur, while imaginary dialogues with absent friends or family members would provide temporary comfort at the cost of further disconnection from reality. Physical changes in your appearance would provide disturbing visual reminders of your deteriorating condition every time you saw your reflection in windows or standing water. Weight loss from inadequate nutrition would make your clothes hang loosely, while poor hygiene and exposure to the elements would alter your appearance in ways that made you almost unrecognizable to yourself. These visual changes would reinforce your psychological transformation from the person you had been in normal society to whatever you were becoming in response to circumstances that no amount of previous experience could have prepared you to handle. The stranger looking back at you from reflective surfaces would seem like someone else entirely, someone whose moral boundaries and behavioral patterns bore little resemblance to your previous self-image. The gradual abandonment of social norms and personal standards would accelerate as your situation became more desperate, with each compromise justified by immediate survival needs, but contributing to an overall transformation that might be irreversible even if rescue eventually arrived. Behaviors that would have disgusted you under normal circumstances would begin to seem reasonable or even necessary. Hygiene standards that had once been automatic would be abandoned when maintaining cleanliness required time and resources that could be better used for finding food or water. Table manners and eating customs would disappear when consuming anything edible became more important than how you consumed it. Social courtesies and interpersonal considerations would seem absurdly irrelevant when there was no one left to be courteous to. The psychological mechanism that normally prevented people from handling corpses or consuming spoiled food would gradually weaken under the pressure of necessity, allowing you to take actions that would have triggered violent revulsion during your previous life. This adaptation might be essential for survival, but would also represent a fundamental change in your basic humanity that couldn't be easily reversed. Your relationship with property and ownership would undergo similarly dramatic transformation as the legal and social structures that defined these concepts ceased to exist. Everything in the town would gradually come to seem like it belonged to you by right of survival, while simultaneously seeming to belong to no one because the people who had owned it were all dead. This shift in perspective would make looting and scavenging feel morally neutral rather than like theft, but would also contribute to a broader erosion of ethical constraints that had previously guided your behavior. If property rights didn't apply, what other social rules might be safely ignored when they conflicted with survival needs? The question of what you owed to the dead would become increasingly complex as your desperation grew and their possessions became more essential to your survival. Initially, you might feel obligated to treat corpses and their belongings with respect, perhaps even attempting basic burial procedures or avoiding unnecessary disturbance of their final arrangements. But as hunger, thirst, and exposure threatened your immediate survival, these respectful impulses would conflict with practical necessities that required you to search through personal effects, remove clothing or equipment from bodies, or disturb burial sites to access resources that might keep you alive for additional days or weeks. Each compromise with your previous moral standards would make the next compromise easier to rationalize, creating a slippery slope of ethical degradation that could transform you into someone who would be unrecognizable to people who had known you before the epidemic. The person who eventually emerged from this experience, if anyone did, might bear little resemblance to the person who had originally awakened in the plague-stricken town. Religious or philosophical beliefs that had previously provided comfort and moral guidance would be tested by circumstances that seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions about justice, divine providence, or the meaning of human existence. If there was a benevolent deity watching over human affairs, how could such complete devastation be permitted to occur? If life had inherent meaning and purpose, what was the purpose of mass death that served no apparent constructive function? These existential questions would demand mental energy that you needed for practical survival tasks, but couldn't be easily dismissed or postponed when they arose spontaneously in response to the evidence of meaningless suffering that surrounded you. The cognitive dissonance between your previous worldview and current reality would create additional psychological stress that compounded all the other mental pressures you were facing. The complete absence of any authority figures or social institutions would force you to become the sole arbiter of every decision, from trivial choices about which building to explore, next to life and death determinations about acceptable risk levels for various survival strategies. This absolute responsibility would be simultaneously liberating and terrifying as you realized that there was literally no one else to blame or consult when your choices proved to be mistakes. Leadership skills that you might never have needed to develop would suddenly become essential for managing your own survival, while decision-making capabilities that had been adequate for normal circumstances would prove insufficient for the types of complex, high-stakes choices you now faced multiple times each day. The weight of making decisions that could determine whether you lived or died, without any external input or validation, would create a form of psychological pressure that could lead to decision paralysis at exactly the moments when rapid action was most essential. The fear of making wrong choices would compete with the knowledge that failing to make any choice was often the worst option available. Your memory would begin playing tricks on you as stress and malnutrition affected cognitive function, making it increasingly difficult to remember important information about resource locations, safe routes, or lessons learned from previous mistakes. Details that seemed clearly established in your mind would become uncertain, while false memories created by psychological trauma would feel as real as actual experiences. This cognitive unreliability would make planning increasingly difficult, as you couldn't trust your own recollections about which areas had been thoroughly searched, which water sources had proven safe, or which routes had been attempted unsuccessfully. The gradual degradation of memory function would force you to waste time and energy retracing steps, and relearning lessons that should have been permanent. Navigation would become increasingly challenging as familiar landmarks took on different significance and appearance under the altered circumstances of complete abandonment. Streets and buildings that had seemed clearly distinct during normal times would begin to blur together when they were all equally empty and contaminated, making it easy to become lost even in areas you thought you knew well. The psychological maps that normally helped people navigate familiar territory would prove inadequate when all the usual reference points like open businesses, pedestrian traffic, and maintained signage disappeared. Areas that had seemed completely different during normal times would look remarkably similar when they were all equally devastated, creating navigation confusion that could waste precious time and energy. Weather would transition from background environmental condition to primary survival threat, as your resources and shelter options dwindled, with each passing storm system representing a potential crisis that could end your survival attempt through exposure, flooding, or destruction of whatever minimal shelter you had managed to establish. The seasonal progression that you had previously taken for granted would become a countdown timer, marking the approach of temperature extremes that you were increasingly less prepared to handle. Winter cold that would have been manageable with adequate heating, insulation, and nutrition would become potentially fatal when you lacked all three basic requirements for thermal regulation. Summer heat that had once been merely uncomfortable would threaten deadly hypothermia when combined with dehydration, malnutrition, and the physical stress of constant survival activities. Your body's normal mechanisms for temperature regulation would be compromised by your deteriorating physical condition, making weather extremes far more dangerous than they would have been under normal circumstances. The psychological impact of being completely helpless against weather changes would reinforce your overall sense of powerlessness and vulnerability, creating additional stress that further compromised your physical resilience and decision-making capabilities. Each approaching storm would represent not just a practical challenge, but an existential reminder of how little control you actually had over the forces that would ultimately determine whether you lived or died. Your relationship with your own body would become increasingly complicated as physical deterioration progressed and survival requirements demanded actions that conflicted with normal comfort and safety preferences. Ignoring pain, pushing beyond normal endurance limits, and accepting levels of hunger and thirst that would have seemed intolerable under previous circumstances would become routine necessities. The disconnect between your mind's survival determination and your body's declining capabilities would create internal conflicts that added psychological stress to already overwhelming physical challenges. Your consciousness would remain focused on survival goals, even as your physical capacity to achieve those goals steadily diminished, creating frustration and despair that could undermine the mental resilience essential for continued survival efforts. The gradual recognition that your body was betraying your survival efforts would manifest in countless small failures that accumulated into overwhelming evidence of systematic breakdown. Tasks that had seemed routine during your first days in the town would become monumental challenges that required careful planning and multiple rest periods to complete successfully. Climbing stairs to search upper floors of buildings would leave you breathless and dizzy, forcing you to pause frequently and question whether the potential resources justified the energy expenditure. Your hands would shake while trying to manipulate simple tools or containers, making basic maintenance tasks frustratingly difficult and time-consuming when efficiency was essential for survival. The muscle weakness that accompanied malnutrition would affect your ability to carry supplies, break down doors, or defend yourself against potential threats, creating cascading vulnerabilities that made every aspect of survival more precarious. Your grip strength would diminish to the point where holding onto climbing surfaces or weapon handles became unreliable, introducing new categories of risk into activities that had already pushed your capabilities beyond normal limits. Vision problems caused by vitamin deficiencies and constant stress would make navigation increasingly treacherous, particularly during low-light conditions that occurred frequently in buildings with broken windows or collapsed sections. Your depth perception would become unreliable, causing you to misjudge distances when stepping over debris or climbing through damaged structures, leading to falls and injuries that further compromised your already fragile physical condition. Hearing changes would affect your ability to detect approaching threats or identify the sources of sounds that might indicate resources, other survivors, or environmental dangers. The psychological hypervigilance that kept you constantly alert for potential threats would be undermined by sensory degradation that made accurate threat assessment increasingly difficult and unreliable. Your immune system's progressive failure would make minor cuts and scrapes into serious medical emergencies that could develop into life-threatening infections without access to proper treatment. Every interaction with contaminated surfaces or materials would carry increased risk of illness as your body's natural defenses weakened under the combined assault of malnutrition, stress, and constant exposure to pathogens. The cognitive effects of prolonged survival stress would begin interfering with the complex problem-solving abilities that had initially enabled you to navigate the challenges of your situation successfully. Mathematical calculations required for rationing supplies would become increasingly difficult, leading to errors in resource management that shortened your survival timeline or left you without essential materials when they were most needed. Memory consolidation would suffer as your brain prioritized immediate survival processing over long-term information storage, causing you to forget important lessons learned through dangerous trial and error experiences. The location of resource caches, the results of previous exploration attempts, and the characteristics of safe versus dangerous areas would become increasingly fuzzy, forcing you to waste precious time and energy relearning information that should have been permanently retained. Language processing would deteriorate in subtle ways that reflected the broader cognitive decline accompanying your physical breakdown. Words that had once come easily would require conscious effort to recall, while complex thoughts would become difficult to organize and express even in your internal monologue. This linguistic degradation would make it harder to think through complicated survival strategies or analyze the potential consequences of different courses of action, reducing your decision-making to increasingly simple and potentially inadequate responses to complex challenges. The psychological defense mechanisms that had initially protected you from the full emotional impact of your situation would begin failing as your mental resources became overwhelmed by the sustained intensity of survival stress. Denial that had allowed you to function during the early phases would give way to periods of crushing despair that made continuing survival efforts feel pointless and impossible. Emotional numbness that had protected you from the horror of constant exposure to death would alternate unpredictably with episodes of overwhelming grief, terror, and rage that consumed mental energy needed for practical survival tasks. These emotional swings would become increasingly extreme and difficult to control as your psychological stability deteriorated under conditions that far exceeded normal human capacity for adaptation. The absence of any external validation for your survival efforts would make maintaining motivation increasingly difficult, as days stretched into weeks without any sign of rescue or improvement in your circumstances. The hope that had initially sustained your efforts would gradually be replaced by mechanical persistence that continued survival activities without any genuine belief that they would ultimately succeed. Sleep disturbances would intensify as your physical discomfort increased, and your anxiety about nighttime vulnerabilities became more acute, with your declining ability to respond effectively to potential threats. The restorative sleep that was essential for maintaining both physical and mental function would become increasingly elusive, creating a feedback loop where sleep deprivation accelerated all other aspects of your deterioration. Nightmares, when sleep finally came, would blend memories of your previous life with the horrors of your current situation in ways that made waking up increasingly disorienting and emotionally devastating. Dreams of normal activities like family gatherings or workplace meetings would seem so real that awakening to find yourself surrounded by death and contamination would trigger renewed grief for everything you had lost. The boundary between waking consciousness and dream states would become increasingly blurred as hallucinations began occurring during periods when you thought you were fully alert and oriented. Conversations with imaginary companions would provide temporary emotional relief, but would also indicate progressive disconnection from reality that could lead to dangerous decisions based on false perceptions. Visual hallucinations might cause you to see movement where none existed, leading to wasted energy, investigating imaginary threats, or pursuing phantom opportunities for resources or rescue. Auditory hallucinations could make you believe you heard voices calling for help, causing you to expose yourself to danger while attempting to locate and assist people who weren't actually there. The social isolation would begin affecting your sense of personal identity in ways that went beyond simple loneliness to encompass fundamental questions about what it meant to be human when all the social relationships that normally defined humanity had been stripped away. Without other people to reflect your personality back to you through interactions and shared experiences, your sense of self would begin to feel unstable and uncertain. Behaviors and personality traits that had seemed like permanent aspects of your character would prove to be more dependent on social context than you had realized, disappearing or transforming as the environmental pressures of survival replaced the social pressures that had previously shaped your behavior patterns. The moral framework that had guided your previous decisions would be systematically challenged by survival necessities that conflicted with ethical principles you had never expected to question. Each compromise with your previous standards would make subsequent compromises easier to rationalize, leading to a gradual erosion of moral constraints that might ultimately transform you into someone unrecognizable to people who had known you before. Religious or philosophical beliefs that had provided comfort and meaning would be tested by circumstances that seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions about fairness, purpose, and the nature of existence itself. The suffering you witnessed and experienced would raise questions about divine justice or cosmic meaning that demanded mental energy you couldn't afford to spend on abstract contemplation. The complete breakdown of social institutions would force you to confront the reality that civilization was far more fragile than you had ever imagined, depending entirely on the continued cooperation of large numbers of people who could withdraw their participation at any time. The infrastructure, services, and security that had seemed permanent and reliable would be revealed as temporary constructions that could disappear overnight when the human systems maintaining them collapsed. This recognition would fundamentally alter your understanding of stability and security, making it impossible to ever again take for granted the complex social arrangements that made normal life possible. Even if you eventually reached safety and returned to civilized society, the knowledge of how quickly and completely that society could collapse would color every aspect of your future experience. The gradual acceptance that rescue was unlikely would not bring the peace that might be expected from certainty, but would instead create a new form of psychological torture where hope and despair alternated in cycles that prevented you from fully committing to either continued struggle or peaceful acceptance of death. During moments of clarity, rational analysis would demonstrate that your survival prospects were essentially zero given your limited resources and deteriorating condition. But human psychology was not designed to accept certain death gracefully, and survival instincts would continue generating optimistic scenarios even when logic proved their impossibility. This internal conflict between reason and instinct would consume precious mental energy while preventing you from making clear decisions about how to spend whatever time remained. The question of whether to continue exhausting yourself in futile survival efforts or to conserve energy for a more peaceful death would become increasingly urgent as your physical capabilities declined. Weather patterns would transition from inconvenience to existential threat as your ability to maintain adequate shelter and clothing deteriorated along with your physical condition. Temperature extremes that would have been manageable with proper preparation would become potentially fatal when you lacked the resources and energy to respond appropriately. Seasonal changes that had once marked pleasant transitions in normal life would become ominous countdowns to conditions you were increasingly less prepared to survive. The approach of winter would represent a deadline for either escaping your situation or dying from exposure, while summer heat would threaten fatal dehydration when your water sources were contaminated and your physical condition compromised your ability to regulate body temperature. Storm systems would pose immediate dangers to whatever minimal shelter you had managed to establish, potentially destroying in hours the protection that had taken days or weeks to construct. The psychological impact of losing shelter repeatedly would be almost as devastating as the physical exposure, reinforcing your sense of powerlessness against forces beyond your control. Your relationship with the dead would evolve in disturbing ways as survival necessities overcame normal cultural taboos about handling corpses and disturbing burial sites. The respect for the deceased that had initially guided your behavior would gradually give way to practical considerations about accessing resources that might extend your survival. Personal belongings of the dead would transition from sacred relics that deserved respectful treatment to potential tools and supplies that could be evaluated purely on their utility for keeping you alive. This transformation would represent another step in the progressive abandonment of social norms that had previously defined your moral boundaries. The physical presence of corpses would become normalized through constant exposure, losing the shocking impact that had initially made exploration of contaminated areas psychologically difficult. This adaptation might be necessary for survival, but would also represent a fundamental change in your relationship with mortality that could never be completely reversed. Scavenging through personal effects would provide disturbing insights into the lives and final moments of the dead, creating unwanted intimacy with people you had never met, but whose possessions now sustained your survival efforts. Family photographs, personal letters, and diary entries would tell stories of hopes and dreams that had been cut short by the same fate you were fighting to avoid. The question of what you owed to these unknown victims would become increasingly complex as your own desperation grew and their resources became more essential to your continued existence. Gratitude for their inadvertent contribution to your survival would compete with guilt about benefiting from their tragedy and fear that you were destined to follow their path to the same ultimate outcome. The gradual realization that you were probably going to die in this place would not arrive as a sudden revelation, but would seep into your consciousness like a slow poison, coloring every decision and action with the weight of probable futility, while simultaneously making each moment feel both precious and meaningless. The acceptance of probable death would not bring the peaceful resignation that literature and philosophy often describe, but would instead create a peculiar form of psychological limbo, where every action carried simultaneous significance and meaninglessness. You would find yourself carefully rationing the last drops of questionable water, while simultaneously questioning why prolonging agony for another day or two held any value whatsoever. This existential contradiction would manifest in behaviors that seemed irrational from the outside, but felt perfectly logical within the distorted framework of your deteriorating mental state. You might spend hours meticulously organizing supplies that you knew you would never have the strength to use, or carefully planning escape routes that required physical capabilities you no longer possessed. The human mind's inability to fully accept its own extinction would continue generating survival strategies even when every rational analysis proved their impossibility. The mechanical continuation of survival activities would become divorced from any genuine hope of success, transforming into ritualistic behaviors that provided psychological structure in an environment where all external frameworks had collapsed. The routine of checking water containers, searching for food, and maintaining shelter would persist, not because these activities offered real benefits, but because abandoning them would require confronting the full horror of your helplessness. Your perception of time would become increasingly distorted as the normal markers that regulate human consciousness continued to disappear. Hours spent in terrified vigilance would stretch endlessly, while entire days of exhausted wandering would compress into fragmented memories that felt like brief moments. This temporal disorientation would make tracking the progression of your deterioration increasingly difficult, creating uncertainty about how much time might remain and whether that uncertainty was a blessing or an additional source of torture. The physical sensation of dying slowly would prove far different from the dramatic death scenes portrayed in popular media. Instead of climactic moments of clarity or peaceful acceptance, your body would simply continue failing in small, incremental ways that made each day marginally worse than the previous one. Hunger would transition from acute pain to a dull ache that eventually became so familiar it felt normal, while thirst would evolve from desperate craving to a constant background sensation that colored every thought and action. Your skin would begin showing signs of malnutrition and dehydration that made looking at your own reflection increasingly disturbing. The person staring back from broken windows and standing water would seem like a stranger whose appearance bore little resemblance to your self-image from normal life. Sunken cheeks, prominent bones, and hollow eyes would provide visual confirmation of systematic breakdown that your mind still struggled to fully accept. The gradual loss of muscle mass would affect not just your strength and endurance, but your basic coordination and fine motor control. Tasks that had once been automatic, like buttoning clothing or manipulating small objects, would require conscious effort and multiple attempts. Your handwriting, if you attempted to leave any record of your experience, would become increasingly shaky and illegible as muscle control deteriorated. Sleep, when exhaustion finally overcame fear and discomfort, would bring no real relief from your suffering. Dreams would blend memories of normal life with current horrors in ways that made awakening feel like dying repeatedly. You might dream of sitting down to family dinners or attending social gatherings, only to wake up surrounded by corpses and contamination, creating jarring transitions that reinforced your psychological isolation. The boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness would blur as hallucinations became more frequent and vivid. Conversations with imaginary companions would provide temporary comfort, while simultaneously indicating progressive disconnection from reality. These phantom interactions would feel completely real while they occurred, making the return to actual solitude even more devastating when awareness of their illusory nature eventually returned. Visual distortions would begin affecting your ability to navigate safely through the contaminated environment. Depth perception would become unreliable, causing you to misjudge distances when stepping over debris or climbing through damaged structures. Your peripheral vision would start playing tricks on you, creating the impression of movement where none existed and causing you to waste precious energy investigating imaginary threats or opportunities. Color perception might begin shifting as vitamin deficiencies affected your nervous system, making it harder to identify safe versus contaminated food sources or to recognize familiar landmarks that could aid in navigation. The world would gradually take on a gray, washed-out quality that reflected your internal emotional state, while also making practical survival tasks more difficult and dangerous. Hearing changes would compound your sensory difficulties, making it harder to detect approaching threats or identify the sources of sounds that might indicate resources or other survivors. Tinnitus might develop, creating constant background noise that interfered with your ability to process important auditory information about your environment. Conversations with yourself would become increasingly common as the human need for social interaction demanded some outlet, even when rational communication was impossible. The progressive failure of your immune system would transform minor injuries into potentially fatal medical emergencies. Cuts that would have healed quickly under normal circumstances would become infected despite your best efforts at basic first aid. Without access to antibiotics or proper medical supplies, even superficial wounds could develop into systemic infections that would end your survival attempt within days. Bruises would take longer to heal and would appear more easily as your circulatory system struggled to function with inadequate nutrition and hydration. Your skin would become more fragile, tearing easily when scraped against rough surfaces, or caught on debris during your exploration of contaminated buildings. Each new injury would represent not just immediate pain and inconvenience, but another potential pathway for fatal infection. Dental problems would emerge as oral hygiene became impossible to maintain with contaminated water and no access to proper cleaning supplies. Tooth pain could become severe enough to interfere with your ability to consume what little food you manage to find, creating additional barriers to maintaining adequate nutrition. Gum disease would develop rapidly under conditions of poor hygiene and nutritional deficiency, potentially leading to tooth loss that would further compromise your eating capabilities. Your digestive system would struggle to process the contaminated and spoiled foods that represented your only available nutrition sources. Chronic diarrhea would accelerate dehydration while making it dangerous to venture far from whatever shelter you had established. Stomach cramps would become constant companions, making sleep difficult and consuming mental energy that you needed for survival planning. The psychological impact of watching your own body systematically fail would be almost as devastating as the physical effects themselves. Each new symptom would provide evidence that your situation was hopeless, while simultaneously demanding attention and resources that diverted energy from other survival activities. The person you had been before the epidemic would seem like someone from another lifetime, separated from your current reality by experiences that no amount of recovery could ever fully undo. Cognitive functions would continue declining as malnutrition and stress took their toll on brain chemistry and neural connectivity. Mathematical calculations required for rationing supplies would become increasingly difficult, leading to errors that could shorten your survival timeline. Memory consolidation would suffer, causing you to forget lessons learned through dangerous experiences and forcing you to repeatedly rediscover information that should have been permanently retained. Language processing would deteriorate in subtle but important ways. Words that had once come easily would require conscious effort to recall, while complex thoughts would become difficult to organize and express even in your internal monologue. This linguistic degradation would make it harder to think through complicated survival strategies or analyze potential consequences of different courses of action. Your sense of personal identity would become increasingly fluid and uncertain as all the social relationships and environmental contexts that had previously defined who you were simply disappeared. Personality traits that had seemed like permanent aspects of your character would prove to be more dependent on external circumstances than you had ever realized, changing or vanishing entirely as survival pressures replaced social expectations. The moral framework that had guided your previous decisions would be systematically dismantled by necessities that conflicted with ethical principles you had never expected to question. Each compromise with your former standards would make subsequent compromises easier to rationalize, creating a slippery slope of ethical degradation that transformed you into someone who might be unrecognizable to people who had known you before. Religious or philosophical beliefs that had previously provided comfort and meaning would be tested by circumstances that seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions about justice, divine providence, or the inherent meaning of existence. The suffering you witnessed and experienced would raise questions that demanded mental energy you couldn't afford to spend on abstract contemplation, while failing to provide answers that offered any practical guidance for your situation. The complete absence of any authority figures or social institutions would force you to become the sole arbiter of every decision, from trivial choices about which areas to explore to life and death determinations about acceptable risk levels for various survival strategies. This absolute responsibility would be simultaneously liberating and terrifying, as you realize there was literally no one else to consult when your choices proved to be mistakes. Weather would transition from background environmental condition to primary survival threat as your shelter options and physical resilience continued to deteriorate. Each approaching storm system would represent a potential crisis that could end your survival attempt through exposure, flooding, or destruction of whatever minimal protection you had managed to establish. the psychological impact of being completely helpless against weather changes would reinforce your overall sense of powerlessness and vulnerability. Your relationship with the physical spaces around you would evolve in disturbing ways as familiarity bred a false sense of security in environments that remained fundamentally dangerous. Buildings that had initially seemed threatening would begin to feel like home simply because they were known quantities, even when their structural integrity was compromised and their contamination levels remained deadly. The gradual accumulation of small injuries and chronic health problems would create cascading effects that made every aspect of survival increasingly difficult. A sprained ankle that would have been a minor inconvenience under normal circumstances could become a fatal disability when it prevented you from reaching water sources or escaping from dangerous situations. Respiratory problems caused by constant exposure to dust and contaminated air could progress to the point where simple exertion left you breathless and dizzy. Skin conditions would develop as hygiene became impossible to maintain and your body's natural defenses weakened. Rashes, sores, and infections would create constant discomfort, while also providing additional pathways for more serious systemic illnesses. The inability to properly clean and treat these conditions would make them progressively worse, creating feedback loops where declining health made self-care more difficult, which in turn accelerated further health deterioration. Your hands would become increasingly damaged from constant contact with rough surfaces, contaminated materials, and sharp debris encountered during scavenging activities. Cuts, burns, and abrasions would accumulate until your hands were more scar tissue than healthy skin, making fine motor tasks increasingly painful and difficult. The loss of tactile sensitivity would make it harder to manipulate tools and assess the safety of surfaces or materials. Vision problems would intensify as nutritional deficiencies affected your nervous system, and constant stress took its toll on your overall health. Night blindness would make navigation increasingly dangerous during low light conditions, while day vision might become blurry or unreliable in ways that made identifying resources or threats more difficult. Reading any written materials you encountered would become challenging, limiting your access to potentially useful information. The psychological defense mechanisms that had initially protected you from the full emotional impact of your situation would begin failing as your mental resources became overwhelmed. Denial that had allowed you to function during early phases would give way to periods of crushing despair that made continuing survival efforts feel pointless. Emotional numbness that had shielded you from horror would alternate with episodes of overwhelming grief and terror that consumed energy needed for practical tasks. Sleep disturbances would intensify as physical discomfort increased and anxiety about nighttime vulnerabilities became more acute. The restorative sleep essential for maintaining both physical and mental function would become increasingly elusive, creating feedback loops where sleep deprivation accelerated all other aspects of your deterioration. Nightmares would blend memories of normal life with current horrors in ways that made waking up feel like repeated deaths. The social isolation would begin affecting your sense of what it meant to be human, when all the relationships that normally defined humanity had been stripped away. Without other people to reflect your personality through interactions and shared experiences, your sense of self would become unstable and uncertain. Behaviors that had seemed like permanent character traits would disappear or transform as environmental pressures replaced social expectations. Language would become increasingly important as your only remaining connection to human communication. Even when there was no one left to communicate with, you might find yourself narrating your activities aloud or conducting imaginary conversations with absent friends and family members, not because you believed they could hear you, but because the human need for linguistic expression would demand some outlet regardless of its practical futility. The mechanical repetition of survival routines would provide psychological structure in an environment where all external frameworks had collapsed, but would also become increasingly divorced from any genuine hope of success. Checking water containers, searching for food, and maintaining shelter would persist as ritualistic behaviors that offered the illusion of control while actually accomplishing little beyond postponing inevitable collapse. Your understanding of civilization would be fundamentally altered by witnessing how quickly and completely complex social systems could disintegrate when faced with crisis. The infrastructure, services, and security that had seemed permanent would be revealed as temporary constructions that depended entirely on continued human cooperation. This knowledge would make it impossible to ever again take for granted the social arrangements that made normal life possible. The question of whether continuing to struggle served any meaningful purpose would become increasingly urgent as your condition deteriorated and rational analysis demonstrated the futility of further resistance. The energy required to maintain survival activities could potentially be conserved for a more peaceful death, but human instincts would continue driving you toward actions that prolonged suffering without offering realistic hope of escape. Time itself would lose much of its meaning as the normal rhythms that regulated consciousness disappeared along with social structures that had previously provided temporal anchoring. Past and present would begin blending together as memory became unreliable and hallucinations made it difficult to distinguish between actual experiences and imagined events. The future would contract to encompass only the next few hours or days, as longer-term planning became impossible given your declining capabilities. The realization that you were experiencing humanity's ultimate nightmare would carry implications that extended far beyond your personal suffering, forcing you to confront fundamental questions about the nature of civilization, the meaning of individual existence, and the fragility of everything that made human life worth living. These philosophical considerations would demand attention, even when you lack the mental resources to process them adequately, creating additional stress that further compromised your ability to focus on immediate survival needs. The knowledge that countless other people throughout history had faced identical circumstances would provide no comfort, instead reinforcing your understanding of how common and inevitable this type of catastrophe had always been. The plague-ridden town that had become your prison was not an aberration, but a recurring feature of human existence. A reminder that the safety and security of normal life was always temporary and could disappear without warning. Your story would join the millions of similar stories that had played out in plague-stricken communities throughout human history, each representing an individual tragedy that was simultaneously unique and utterly predictable. The person you had been before awakening in this nightmare would fade away like morning mist, replaced by someone shaped entirely by circumstances that no amount of previous experience could have prepared you to handle successfully. The transformation from civilized person to desperate survivor would accelerate dramatically as your physical condition reached critical thresholds that made even basic survival activities monumentally difficult. The energy required to search for water would consume more calories than your malnourished body could afford to expend, creating impossible calculations where every action carried the potential to hasten your demise through sheer exhaustion. Your muscles would begin consuming themselves as your body desperately sought protein sources to maintain vital organ function, leaving you increasingly weak and unsteady on your feet. Simple tasks like opening containers or climbing over debris would require multiple attempts and frequent rest periods, transforming activities that had once taken minutes into hour-long ordeals that left you gasping and dizzy. The psychological impact of feeling your own strength systematically abandon you would prove almost as devastating as the physical limitations themselves. Each day would bring new evidence of capabilities you had permanently lost, creating a countdown of declining function that made your ultimate fate feel increasingly inevitable, despite your continued efforts to postpone it. Walking would become an exercise in careful balance and momentum conservation as your legs struggled to support your diminishing body weight over uneven surfaces cluttered with debris from structural collapse and human neglect. Stairs would present particular challenges, requiring you to rest on every landing, while your cardiovascular system fought to deliver adequate oxygen to muscles that were already operating at the edge of failure. Your coordination would deteriorate to the point where reaching for objects required conscious planning and multiple attempts, as your brain struggled to accurately control movements with limbs that no longer responded reliably to mental commands. Fine motor skills, essential for manipulating containers, tools, or door handles, would become exercises in frustration that consumed precious mental energy alongside physical resources. The trembling in your hands would intensify until holding lightweight objects became challenging, while attempting to perform delicate tasks like threading rope or picking locks would prove virtually impossible. Your handwriting, if you attempted to leave any record of your experience, would degenerate into barely legible scratches that reflected the systematic breakdown of neural pathways controlling precise muscle movements. Visual disturbances would compound your navigation difficulties, as malnutrition affected your nervous system in ways that made distinguishing between safe and dangerous pathways increasingly unreliable. Depth perception would become so compromised that stepping over gaps or judging the stability of surfaces would require careful testing that wasted time and energy you couldn't afford to squander. Colors would begin appearing muted and indistinct, making it harder to identify potentially edible plants or recognize warning signs that had been painted or marked by previous survivors, attempting to communicate dangers to future discoverers. The world would gradually take on a grey, washed-out quality that reflected your internal state, while making practical survival tasks more challenging. Night vision would deteriorate to the point where moving after dark became extremely hazardous, forcing you to limit exploration activities to daylight hours when your energy levels were already compromised by poor sleep and chronic exhaustion. The inability to utilize nighttime hours for travel or resource gathering would effectively reduce your productive time by half, accelerating the consumption of limited supplies. Your hearing would become unreliable in ways that made detecting potential threats or identifying useful sounds increasingly difficult. Tinnitus might develop, creating constant background noise that interfered with your ability to process important environmental information about approaching weather, structural instability, or the presence of other survivors who might represent either opportunities for assistance or additional dangers to avoid. Conversations with yourself would increase in frequency and duration as social isolation took its psychological toll, but your voice would become increasingly hoarse and weak from dehydration and malnutrition. The effort required to speak aloud would begin feeling disproportionate to any comfort it provided, creating another small loss in your arsenal of coping mechanisms. Your digestive system would struggle increasingly with whatever food sources you managed to locate, as chronic malnutrition compromised your bodies to process even basic nutrients effectively. Stomach cramps would become constant companions that made concentration difficult, while digestive irregularities would create additional complications for managing hydration and energy levels. The psychological torture of hunger would evolve through distinct phases that each brought their own forms of suffering. Initial acute hunger pangs would give way to a gnawing emptiness that dominated your thoughts and made focusing on other survival tasks increasingly difficult. Eventually, even this would fade into a dull ache that felt almost normal, but which represented your body's resignation to starvation rather than any actual improvement in your condition. Food would begin to seem like an abstract concept rather than something you had ever actually consumed regularly, as memories of normal meals became increasingly distant and surreal. The idea that you had once eaten multiple times per day without thinking about scarcity would seem like recollections from someone else's life, completely disconnected from your current reality of rationing, single bites of questionable sustenance. Your relationship with water would become increasingly desperate and irrational as dehydration affected your judgment and made every drop seem precious beyond measure. You might find yourself staring at puddles of obviously contaminated liquid for long periods, calculating odds that your rational mind couldn't actually process, while your body screamed for hydration, regardless of the consequences. The sound of dripping water would become torture that drew your attention away from other important survival activities, creating obsessive fixations on moisture sources that might prove completely inaccessible or fatally contaminated. Rain would trigger responses that bordered on religious ecstasy, even when you lacked adequate containers to collect clean water, or when the precipitation carried obvious signs of chemical or biological contamination. Sleep would become increasingly elusive as physical discomfort intensified, and your anxiety about nighttime vulnerabilities grew in proportion to your declining ability to respond effectively to potential threats. The restoration that sleep should have provided would be compromised by nightmares that blended memories of normal life with current horrors in ways that made awakening feel like dying repeatedly. Your dreams would take on qualities that seem more real than your waking experiences, creating confusion about which memories were actual and which were products of your deteriorating mental state. Conversations with family members or friends would feel completely authentic while they occurred, making the return to solitary reality even more devastating when consciousness eventually returned. The boundary between sleeping and waking would blur as hallucinations became more frequent and vivid during periods when you believed yourself to be fully alert. Visual distortions might cause you to see movement where none existed, leading to wasted energy investigating phantom threats or pursuing imaginary opportunities for resources or rescue. Auditory hallucinations would create the impression of voices calling for help or conversations occurring in nearby buildings, causing you to expose yourself to danger while attempting to locate and assist people who existed only in your deteriorating consciousness. These phantom sounds would feel completely real while they occurred, making it impossible to distinguish between genuine environmental noises and products of your compromised mental state. Your sense of personal identity would become increasingly fluid as all the social relationships and environmental contexts that had previously defined who you were simply evaporated. Personality traits that had seemed like permanent aspects of your character would prove to be more dependent on external circumstances than you had ever realized, disappearing or transforming entirely as survival pressures replaced social expectations. The moral framework that had guided your previous decisions would face systematic dismantling by necessities that conflicted with ethical principles you had never expected to question. Each compromise with your former standards would make subsequent compromises easier to rationalize, creating a progression of ethical degradation that transformed you into someone unrecognizable to people who had known you before the epidemic. Religious or philosophical beliefs that had previously provided comfort and meaning would be tested by circumstances that seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions about justice, divine providence, or the inherent meaning of human existence. The suffering you witnessed and experienced would raise questions that demanded mental energy you couldn't spare, while failing to provide answers that offered practical guidance for your impossible situation. Your understanding of civilization would undergo complete revision as you witnessed how quickly and thoroughly complex social systems could collapse when faced with existential crisis. The infrastructure, services, and security that had seemed permanent and reliable would be revealed as temporary constructions that depended entirely on continued human cooperation and could vanish overnight when that cooperation became impossible to maintain. Law enforcement, medical care, educational institutions, and economic systems would all prove to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined, disappearing completely when there weren't enough healthy people left to staff and maintain them. The realization that everything you had considered stable and dependable was actually contingent on circumstances beyond anyone's control would fundamentally alter your understanding of security and permanence. The knowledge that similar catastrophes had occurred repeatedly throughout human history would provide no comfort, instead reinforcing your growing understanding that the safety and prosperity of normal life was always temporary and could disappear without warning or justification. Plague-stricken communities were not aberrations, but recurring features of human existence, reminders that civilization was always more precarious than its inhabitants wanted to believe. Your story would become one among millions of similar stories that had played out in disease-ravaged settlements throughout recorded history, each representing an individual tragedy that was simultaneously unique in its personal details and utterly predictable in its overall trajectory. The person you had been before awakening in this nightmare would fade away completely, replaced by someone shaped entirely by circumstances that no amount of previous experience could have prepared you to navigate successfully. Weather patterns would take on existential significance as your ability to respond to environmental challenges continued declining. Temperature changes that would have been minor inconveniences under normal circumstances would become life-threatening emergencies when you lacked adequate shelter, clothing, or physical reserves to maintain proper thermal regulation. Rain would present impossible choices between accepting potentially fatal exposure and consuming water that might be contaminated with runoff from decomposing bodies or chemical pollutants. The psychological pressure of needing hydration, while knowing that every available source carried deadly risks, would create forms of decision-making torture that dominated your thoughts and consumed mental energy needed for other survival activities. Wind would become a torment that chilled your malnourished body while carrying scents and sounds that provided disturbing reminders of the death that surrounded you. Storm systems would threaten to destroy whatever minimal shelter you had managed to establish, potentially eliminating in hours the protection that had required days or weeks of exhausting labor to construct. Seasonal transitions would mark countdown timers toward environmental conditions you were increasingly less prepared to survive. The approach of winter would represent a deadline for either escaping your situation or succumbing to exposure, while summer heat would threaten fatal hypothermia when your compromised circulatory system could no longer regulate body temperature effectively. Your relationship with the physical spaces around you would evolve in disturbing directions, as desperation overcame normal psychological barriers about contaminated environments. Buildings that had initially seemed threatening would begin feeling like sanctuary simply because they were familiar, even when their structural integrity remained questionable and their contamination levels stayed potentially lethal. Rooms where people had died would gradually seem less horrifying through repeated exposure, while personal belongings of the deceased would transition from objects deserving respectful treatment to potential resources that could be evaluated purely on their utility for extending your survival. This adaptation might be necessary for continued existence, but would also represent fundamental changes in your humanity that could never be completely reversed. The accumulation of minor injuries and chronic health problems would create cascading effects that made every aspect of survival progressively more challenging. Cuts that refused to heal properly would become infected despite your limited first aid efforts, while bruises and sprains that would have been temporary inconveniences under normal circumstances could develop into permanent disabilities that compromised your mobility and manual dexterity. Dental problems would emerge as oral hygiene became impossible to maintain with contaminated water and no access to proper cleaning supplies. Tooth pain could become severe enough to interfere with your ability to consume whatever food you managed to locate, creating additional barriers to maintaining even minimal nutrition levels necessary for basic metabolic function. Your skin would show increasing signs of malnutrition and poor hygiene as rashes, sores, and infections developed without access to proper treatment. The inability to properly clean and care for these conditions would make them progressively worse, creating feedback loops where declining health made self-care more difficult, which accelerated further deterioration in an endless spiral toward complete physical breakdown. Cognitive functions would continue their relentless decline as your brain struggled to operate with inadequate nutrition and constant stress. Mathematical calculations required for rationing supplies would become increasingly difficult and unreliable, leading to errors in resource management that could shorten your survival timeline or leave you without essential materials when they were most desperately needed. Memory consolidation would suffer as your neural pathways prioritized immediate survival processing over long-term information storage, causing you to forget crucial lessons learned through dangerous trial and error experiences. The locations of resource caches, the results of previous exploration attempts, and the characteristics of safe versus hazardous areas would become increasingly fuzzy and unreliable, forcing you to waste precious time and energy repeatedly rediscovering information that should have been permanently retained. Language processing would deteriorate in ways that made complex thinking increasingly difficult and frustrating. Words that had once come easily would require conscious effort to recall, while organizing complicated thoughts would become challenging even in your internal monologue. This linguistic degradation would compromise your ability to think through sophisticated survival strategies or analyze the potential consequences of different courses of action. The mechanical continuation of survival routines would become increasingly divorced from any genuine hope of success, transforming into ritualistic behaviors that provided psychological structure without accomplishing meaningful improvements in your situation. Checking water containers, searching for food, and maintaining shelter would persist as automatic activities that offered the illusion of purposeful action, while actually serving mainly to postpone the moment when you would be forced to confront the complete futility of continued resistance. Your perception of time would become increasingly distorted as normal temporal markers disappeared and your consciousness struggled to maintain coherent awareness of duration and sequence. Hours spent in terrified vigilance would seem to stretch endlessly, while entire days of exhausted wandering might compress into fragmented memories that felt like brief moments of disconnected experience. The past would begin blending with the present as your memory became unreliable and hallucinations made it difficult to distinguish between actual experiences and imagined events. Conversations with people from your previous life would feel completely real while they occurred, making the return to isolated reality even more psychologically devastating when awareness of their illusory nature eventually returned. Future planning would contract to encompass only the most immediate concerns as longer-term thinking became impossible, given your declining cognitive capabilities and the obvious trajectory of your physical deterioration. The concept of next week or next month would seem as abstract and meaningless as the idea of next year, while even tomorrow would feel uncertain and potentially beyond your capacity to reach. The recognition that you were living through one of humanity's most fundamental nightmares would carry implications that extended far beyond your personal suffering, forcing you to confront ultimate questions about the nature of existence, the meaning of individual life, and the fragility of everything that made human civilization seem permanent and secure. These philosophical considerations would demand attention even when you lack the mental resources to process them adequately, creating additional stress that further compromised your ability to focus on immediate survival needs. The knowledge that your experience was neither unique nor particularly significant in the broader context of human history would provide no comfort, instead reinforcing your understanding of how common and inevitable this type of catastrophe had always been throughout human existence. The plague-stricken town that had become your prison represented not an aberration, but a recurring feature of human experience, a reminder that the safety and security of normal life had always been temporary illusions that could be shattered without warning by forces completely beyond individual control or collective preparation. Your transformation from the person you had been before this nightmare began would accelerate toward its inevitable conclusion, shaped by circumstances that no amount of previous experience, education, or preparation could have equipped you to handle successfully. The civilization that had seemed so solid and permanent would be revealed as nothing more than a brief pause between episodes of chaos that represented humanity's natural state throughout most of recorded history. The final phase of your psychological breakdown would manifest in ways that defied every assumption you'd ever made about human resilience and the mind's capacity to endure trauma. What remained of your rational consciousness would begin operating in isolated fragments, like islands of awareness separated by vast oceans of confusion and dissociation that made maintaining coherent thought patterns increasingly impossible. Your internal monologue would fracture into competing voices that seemed to represent different aspects of your personality, arguing with each other about survival strategies, moral choices, and the fundamental question of whether continuing to exist served any meaningful purpose. These mental conversations would feel as real as discussions with other people, creating the illusion of companionship, while actually indicating the progressive dissolution of your integrated sense of self. The voice representing your former civilized self would advocate for maintaining human dignity and moral standards, even in impossible circumstances, insisting that abandoning ethical principles would represent a form of spiritual death that was worse than physical extinction. This aspect of your consciousness would continue generating elaborate justifications for treating the dead with respect and avoiding actions that would have horrified your previous self. Meanwhile, another voice would argue with cold logic that survival required abandoning sentimental attachments to social norms that had become not just irrelevant, but actively dangerous to follow. This survival-focused aspect of your mind would calculate the caloric value of actions with mathematical precision, advocating for choices that maximized your chances of living another day regardless of their ethical implications or psychological consequences. A third voice might emerge that represented pure despair and advocated for simply lying down and accepting death as the most rational response to circumstances that offered no realistic hope of escape or rescue. This defeatist aspect would present compelling arguments about the pointlessness of prolonging suffering when the ultimate outcome was predetermined and inevitable. The constant internal debate between these competing perspectives would consume enormous mental energy that you desperately needed for practical survival tasks, creating another layer of inefficiency in an already desperate situation where every wasted calorie brought you closer to complete collapse. The psychological fragmentation would make decision-making increasingly difficult as different aspects of your consciousness advocated for contradictory courses of action. Your relationship with physical pain would undergo fundamental transformation as your nervous system adapted to constant discomfort that would have been unbearable under normal circumstances. The acute agony of hunger, thirst, and exhaustion would gradually fade into background sensations that felt almost normal, representing your body's attempt to preserve psychological stability by adjusting pain perception thresholds. This adaptation would create dangerous situations where serious injuries or illnesses might not register with appropriate urgency because your pain response system had been overwhelmed and recalibrated to ignore signals that would normally demand immediate attention. Cuts that required treatment might go unnoticed until infections set in, while internal problems could progress to critical stages without generating the alarm responses that would normally motivate corrective action. Your emotional responses would become increasingly unpredictable and inappropriate as psychological defense mechanisms struggle to process trauma that exceeded their design specifications. Moments of inexplicable euphoria might alternate with episodes of crushing despair that bore no obvious relationship to your immediate circumstances, creating mood swings that made rational planning and consistent behavior virtually impossible. Laughter might erupt spontaneously in response to discoveries of fresh corpses or evidence of others' suffering. Not because you found these situations amusing, but because your emotional processing systems had become so overwhelmed that they generated random responses that bore no logical relationship to environmental stimuli. These inappropriate reactions would add another layer of horror to your experience as you realized that even your most basic human responses were becoming unreliable and disturbing. Tears might flow uncontrollably during moments when you felt relatively safe and stable, triggered by memories of trivial kindnesses from your previous life that seemed infinitely precious in retrospect. The contrast between the simple human decencies you had once taken for granted and the complete absence of any human warmth in your current situation would occasionally break through your psychological defenses with overwhelming force. The The physical act of crying would become both emotionally necessary and practically dangerous, as it consumed precious bodily fluids, while potentially attracting attention from threats you might not have the strength to handle. Each tear represented moisture that your dehydrated body could not afford to lose, creating another impossible choice between psychological release and physical survival requirements. Your sleep patterns would deteriorate beyond mere insomnia into a chaotic alternation between unconsciousness and hypervigilant wakefulness that bore no relationship to normal circadian rhythms. Exhaustion would cause you to collapse into brief periods of dreamless oblivion at inappropriate times and locations, leaving you vulnerable to environmental dangers while providing no real restoration for your depleted energy reserves. These involuntary sleep episodes might occur while you were attempting to navigate dangerous terrain, or during critical survival activities like water purification or shelter maintenance, creating additional risks that further compromised your already precarious situation. Awakening from these episodes would be disorienting and frightening as you struggled to remember where you were and what you had been doing before consciousness departed. The dreams that did occur would become increasingly vivid and disturbing as your mind attempted to process experiences that exceeded its normal capacity for integration and understanding. Nightmares would blend realistic elements from your current situation with fantastic distortions that transform survival challenges into surreal horror scenarios where the laws of physics and logic no longer applied. You might dream of being pursued through endless corridors by animated corpses that moved with impossible speed and coordination, or find yourself trapped in buildings that changed their internal layout whenever you tried to navigate toward exits. These dreams would feel completely real while they occurred, making awakening feel like escape from one nightmare into another that happened to correspond more closely to consensus reality. Pleasant dreams about your previous life would become even more psychologically devastating than nightmares because they offered temporary relief that made returning to consciousness feel like falling into hell. Dreams of family gatherings, professional accomplishments, or simple social pleasures would seem absolutely authentic until the moment when awareness returned and revealed them to be cruel illusions that highlighted everything you had lost. The sensory hallucinations that had begun as occasional intrusions would evolve into constant companions that made distinguishing between perception and imagination increasingly impossible. Visual distortions would cause shadows to seem like moving figures, while patterns in wallpaper or debris would appear to shift and writhe when observed with peripheral vision. Auditory hallucinations would create soundscapes of phantom conversations, distant music, or mechanical noises that seemed to emanate from specific locations, but would disappear when investigated directly. These false sounds would often seem more real and immediate than actual environmental noises, causing you to waste precious energy pursuing imaginary audio sources while potentially missing important real sounds that could indicate genuine opportunities or threats. Tactile hallucinations would make you feel phantom touches, crawling sensations, or temperature changes that had no basis in physical reality, but triggered automatic responses that could prove dangerous or exhausting. You might scratch at imaginary insects until your skin was raw and infected, or remove clothing in response to false sensations of overheating that left you vulnerable to actual cold exposure. Olfactory hallucinations would create false scent impressions that could trigger powerful emotional responses or inappropriate behavioral reactions. Phantom smells of cooking food might cause you to waste hours searching for non-existent meal sources, while imaginary odors of smoke could trigger panic responses that consumed energy needed for legitimate survival activities. The boundary between internal mental experience and external environmental reality would become so blurred that making accurate assessments of your situation would require enormous conscious effort that you often lacked the cognitive resources to sustain. Reality testing would become an active process rather than an automatic function, forcing you to constantly question whether your perceptions corresponded to actual conditions or were products of your deteriorating mental state. Your sense of personal agency would gradually erode as the gap between your intentions and your capabilities widened to the point where effective action became increasingly rare and accidental. Tasks that you planned carefully would fail due to physical limitations or cognitive errors, while successful outcomes would seem to occur randomly rather than as results of deliberate effort and skill. This loss of control over your own actions and their consequences would create learned helplessness that made attempting new survival strategies feel pointless, even when rational analysis suggested they might be beneficial. The psychological energy required to overcome this acquired passivity would compete with the mental resources needed for planning and executing survival activities, creating another vicious cycle that accelerated your overall decline. Your understanding of causation would become increasingly magical and irrational, as your ability to analyze complex relationships between actions and outcomes deteriorated. Coincidental events might seem like evidence of supernatural intervention or cosmic significance, while obvious cause and effect relationships might be overlooked or misinterpreted in ways that led to counterproductive behaviors. Superstitious thinking would emerge as your mind sought patterns and meaning in random events that actually reflected nothing more than statistical probability operating in chaotic circumstances. You might begin attributing survival successes to ritual behaviors or lucky charms that had no actual relationship to positive outcomes, while developing elaborate avoidance behaviors based on false correlations between neutral actions and subsequent difficulties. The concept of probability would become increasingly difficult to understand and apply as your mathematical reasoning abilities declined and your emotional responses to uncertainty intensified. Risks that were objectively small might seem terrifyingly large, while genuinely dangerous situations might feel deceptively safe based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment. Your memory would begin operating more like a collection of disconnected fragments than a coherent narrative record of your experiences. Recent events might be forgotten within hours, while vivid recollections from childhood could feel more immediate and real than current circumstances. This temporal confusion would make learning from experience increasingly difficult, as lessons from recent survival attempts would be lost before they could be integrated into future planning. The distinction between memories of actual events and false memories created by dreams, hallucinations, or wishful thinking would become impossible to maintain reliably. You might remember finding food sources that had never existed, or forget the locations of genuine resource caches that you had actually discovered through careful exploration. These memory distortions would make navigation and resource management increasingly unreliable and dangerous. Emotional memories would become disconnected from their original contexts, creating inappropriate responses to current situations based on feelings that had been associated with completely different circumstances. Fear responses that had been adaptive in specific dangerous situations might be triggered by harmless environmental features that happen to share superficial similarities with previous threat locations. Your language capabilities would deteriorate beyond simple vocabulary loss into fundamental disruptions of symbolic thinking and communication processing. The internal verbal narrative that normally provided structure for conscious thought would become fragmentary and disorganized, making complex reasoning increasingly difficult, even when you weren't attempting to communicate with others. Mathematical concepts that had once been automatic would require conscious effort to access and manipulate, making resource calculations and time estimation increasingly unreliable. Basic arithmetic needed for rationing supplies would become challenging mental exercises that consume cognitive energy needed for other survival activities while producing results of questionable accuracy. The symbolic relationships that allowed abstract thinking would begin breaking down, making it difficult to plan beyond immediate concrete actions or to understand complex causal relationships that required mental modeling of hypothetical scenarios. Your thinking would become increasingly literal and present-focused as the cognitive machinery needed for abstract reasoning failed under the combined assault of malnutrition, stress, and social isolation. Reading comprehension would deteriorate even when you encountered written materials that might contain valuable survival information. text that would have been easily understood during normal circumstances would seem like incomprehensible collections of symbols that required enormous effort to decode into meaningful information. Maps, instruction manuals, and warning signs would become increasingly useless as your ability to extract practical information from written sources declined. Your sense of personal continuity would fragment as the connection between your current experience and your previous identity became increasingly tenuous and abstract. The person you remembered being before the epidemic would seem like someone you had once known rather than a previous version of yourself, creating existential confusion about whether you were the same individual who had lived that previous life or an entirely different person who happened to possess some of those memories. Personality traits that had seemed fundamental to your character would continue disappearing or transforming beyond recognition as environmental pressures completely overrode the social conditioning that had previously shaped your behavior patterns. Values, preferences, and behavioral tendencies that had felt permanent would prove to be far more malleable than you had ever imagined, changing in response to circumstances that demanded adaptations incompatible with your previous self-concept. The moral framework that had guided your decisions would complete its systematic dissolution as survival necessities eliminated any practical distinction between right and wrong actions. Ethical principles would become abstract philosophical concepts that bore no relationship to the immediate choices you faced, where every available option carried moral implications that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Your relationship with the concept of future would contract to encompass only the most immediate survival concerns, as longer-term thinking became impossible given your declining cognitive capabilities and obvious physical trajectory. Planning beyond the current day would seem as abstract and meaningless as planning for the next decade, while even the next few hours would feel uncertain and potentially beyond your capacity to reach. Hope would transform from a psychological resource that sustained motivation into a form of cognitive error that wasted mental energy on scenarios that rational analysis proved to be impossible. The optimistic thinking that might have been adaptive during earlier phases of your ordeal would become actively counterproductive as it prevented you from making realistic assessments of your situation and accepting appropriate responses to inevitable outcomes. Acceptance of death would not arrive as the peaceful resignation that philosophical traditions often describe, but as a gradual recognition that continuing to resist had become more painful than the alternative you were fighting to avoid. This acceptance would not bring relief, but would instead create a peculiar psychological state where survival activities continued mechanically, even though conscious motivation for these actions had largely disappeared. The final dissolution of your individual consciousness would begin as the various psychological defense mechanisms that had maintained some semblance of mental coherence finally exhausted themselves and ceased to function. What remained of your awareness would fragment into disconnected sensory impressions and emotional responses that bore little resemblance to normal human consciousness. Your last coherent thoughts would likely focus on fragments of memory from your previous life that had somehow survived the systematic destruction of your mental architecture. These final recollections might involve simple moments of human connection or basic physical comfort that had seemed trivial when you experienced them originally, but now appeared infinitely precious in retrospect. The recognition that you were experiencing the final breakdown of human consciousness would carry a strange mixture of terror and relief as the struggle to maintain awareness in impossible circumstances finally approached its conclusion. The person who had awakened in this plague-stricken town would cease to exist long before your body completed its own inevitable surrender to the forces that had already claimed everyone else who had once called this place home. Your story would end not with dramatic final moments or profound realizations, but with the quiet dissolution of consciousness that represented the ultimate victory of circumstances over individual will. The plague-ridden town would claim another victim whose experience differed only in minor details from the countless others who had preceded you in this ancient dance between human ambition and biological reality. The silence that settled over your final resting place would be the same oppressive quiet that had greeted your awakening in this nightmare, completing a cycle that had repeated itself throughout human history whenever disease, disaster, or conflict overwhelmed the fragile systems that made civilization possible. Your individual tragedy would merge seamlessly into the broader pattern of human suffering that defined these places where dreams came to die, and hope revealed itself to be nothing more than a temporary illusion that made the inevitable slightly more bearable. In the end, you would discover that waking up in a plague-ridden town meant becoming part of a story that was simultaneously unique to your individual experience and utterly predictable in its ultimate trajectory, joining the countless others whose final moments had played out in similar circumstances throughout the long history of humanity's ongoing struggle against forces that were ultimately stronger than any individual will to survive. The morning when you could no longer lift your head from whatever makeshift pillow had supported you through another restless night, would arrive without fanfare or dramatic recognition. Your body would simply refuse to respond to mental commands that had once produced automatic movements, leaving you staring at familiar ceiling stains, while your consciousness struggled to process this new level of helplessness that made all previous limitations seem trivial by comparison. Your arms would lie motionless beside your torso, despite desperate attempts to will them into action. The neural pathways that had once translated thought into movement, now disrupted by malnutrition and cellular breakdown that had progressed beyond your body's ability to compensate through sheer determination. The hands that had once manipulated tools and opened containers would become foreign objects that you could observe but no longer control. Breathing would require conscious effort as your respiratory muscles weakened to the point where each inhalation felt like a deliberate choice rather than an automatic function. The rhythm that had sustained you throughout your entire life would become irregular and labored, with each breath representing a small victory against forces that were systematically shutting down your biological systems one by one. Your vision would narrow to a tunnel that excluded peripheral awareness, focusing your remaining visual processing on a shrinking circle of perception that made the world seem to be disappearing around you. Colors would fade to various shades of grey and brown, while fine details would become increasingly difficult to distinguish as your optical nerves struggled to function with inadequate metabolic support. The sounds that reached your ears would seem to come from enormous distances, even when their sources were actually nearby, creating an acoustic isolation that made you feel separated from your environment by invisible barriers that grew thicker with each passing hour. Your own heartbeat would become audible as a irregular drumming that reminded you of your body's desperate attempts to maintain circulation with insufficient resources. Temperature regulation would fail completely, leaving you alternating between periods of uncontrollable shivering and episodes of feverish heat that bore no relationship to actual environmental conditions. Your skin would feel simultaneously numb and hypersensitive, creating contradictory sensations that your nervous system could no longer interpret or respond to appropriately. The thirst that had tormented you for weeks would gradually fade into background awareness, as your body's alarm systems began shutting down non-essential functions to preserve whatever energy remained for core biological processes. Hunger would disappear entirely as your digestive system ceased operations, having exhausted its ability to extract nutrients from the contaminated substances that had sustained you during earlier phases of your ordeal. Your thoughts would become increasingly disconnected from immediate circumstances, as your brain conserved glucose for the most basic functions needed to maintain consciousness. Planning and analysis would be replaced by fragmentary observations and fleeting emotional responses that lasted only moments before being forgotten or replaced by equally transient mental activity. Memory would operate in reverse chronological order, with recent experiences fading first, while older recollections from childhood and adolescence became increasingly vivid and immediate. You might find yourself reliving conversations from decades past with crystal clarity while being unable to remember what you had attempted to do an hour earlier. The faces of family members and friends would appear in your peripheral vision with startling realism, creating the impression that loved ones were gathering around you during these final moments. These visions would feel completely authentic and comforting, providing psychological relief even when rational awareness recognized them as products of oxygen-deprived neural activity. Your sense of time would collapse entirely as minutes and hours lost all meaningful distinction, creating a subjective experience where moments of awareness seemed to stretch indefinitely while longer periods passed without conscious recognition. The concept of duration would become irrelevant as your consciousness focused exclusively on the immediate present without reference to past or future. Language would begin disappearing as the cognitive resources needed for verbal processing were redirected to more essential functions. Words that had once come automatically would require enormous effort to access, while complex thoughts would become impossible to formulate or maintain long enough for complete development. The internal monologue that had provided structure for your conscious experience throughout your entire life would fade into occasional disconnected phrases and isolated concepts that bore little relationship to coherent communication. Your mind would operate increasingly through pure sensation and emotion, rather than symbolic representation and logical analysis. Physical pain would gradually diminish as your nervous system's capacity for signal transmission weakened beyond the threshold needed for conscious pain perception. The discomfort that had been your constant companion would be replaced by a strange numbness that felt almost pleasant after the prolonged agony of systematic breakdown. Your breathing would become increasingly shallow and irregular as your respiratory center struggled to maintain adequate oxygen exchange with progressively failing lung function. Each breath would require more effort while accomplishing less gas exchange, creating a feedback loop that accelerated the final stages of respiratory failure. The boundary between consciousness and unconsciousness would blur into a continuous spectrum where awareness flickered unpredictably between complete lucidity and total absence. You might experience moments of crystal clear perception, alternating with periods of blank unconsciousness that left no memory traces when awareness eventually returned. Your heartbeat would become increasingly irregular as your cardiovascular system attempted to maintain circulation, despite inadequate fuel and failing regulatory mechanisms. Periods of rapid fluttering heart rhythm would alternate with episodes where cardiac activity nearly ceased, before resuming with erratic timing that reflected your heart's desperate attempts to continue functioning. The warmth would gradually drain from your extremities as your circulatory system prioritized blood flow to vital organs, creating progressive cooling that began with your fingers and toes before advancing toward your core. This thermal retreat would feel strangely peaceful as sensation disappeared from areas that had been sources of pain and discomfort. Your final coherent thoughts would likely involve not the horror of your immediate circumstances, but fragments of ordinary moments from your previous life that had seemed insignificant when they occurred originally. A conversation with a colleague about weekend plans might feel more real and immediate than your current situation, providing psychological comfort during the final dissolution of consciousness. The recognition that these were indeed your final moments would arrive not as dramatic revelation, but as quiet acceptance that felt natural rather than tragic. The struggle that had defined every aspect of your experience since awakening in this plague-stricken town would simply come to an end without fanfare or resolution, representing not defeat, but rather the completion of a story that had always been destined to conclude this way. Your individual awareness would fade gradually rather than ending abruptly, like a radio signal growing weaker until it finally disappeared entirely into static. The person who had fought so desperately to survive against impossible odds would dissolve peacefully into the same silence that had already claimed everyone else who had once inhabited this place. The room where your journey ended would return to the same oppressive quiet that had characterized the entire town since your awakening, with your story joining the countless others whose final chapters had been written in similar circumstances throughout human history. The plague-stricken community would have claimed its final victim, completing another cycle in humanity's eternal struggle against forces that were ultimately more powerful than individual determination or collective preparation. Your transformation from the person you had been in normal society to whatever you had become during these final weeks would serve as testimony to both human resilience and human limitation, demonstrating how quickly civilized individuals could adapt to impossible circumstances while also revealing the ultimate boundaries beyond which adaptation became impossible. The silence that settled over your final moments would be broken only by the environmental sounds that had provided the soundtrack for your entire ordeal in this place. Wind through broken windows, the settling of damaged structures, and the distant calls of scavenging animals would continue their eternal rhythms, indifferent to the human drama that had just concluded in their midst. The plague-ridden town would return to its patient waiting, ready to receive whatever new victims might eventually discover its contaminated streets and abandoned buildings. Your story would become part of the accumulated history of suffering that these places collected like sediment, adding one more layer to the archaeological record of human catastrophe that defined such locations throughout the world. In the end, waking up in a plague-ridden town would prove to be exactly what countless others throughout history had discovered it to be. A test of human endurance that revealed both the remarkable capacity for adaptation that had enabled our species to survive countless catastrophes, and the absolute limits beyond which no amount of intelligence, determination, or moral strength could extend individual existence. Your final contribution to this ancient pattern would be the same as all the others who had preceded you, demonstrating once again that while human beings possessed extraordinary capabilities for survival and adaptation, there were circumstances that exceeded even our most remarkable individual and collective resources. Circumstances where the only remaining choice was how to face the inevitable with whatever dignity remained possible. The plague-ridden town would keep its secrets, as such places always had, holding within its contaminated boundaries the stories of everyone who had discovered too late that some nightmares were not dreams from which awakening was possible, but realities that demanded the ultimate price from anyone unlucky enough to find themselves trapped within their relentless embrace. The weeks that had passed since your first awakening would blur together into an indistinguishable mass of suffering that defied normal human comprehension of temporal experience. Your body would have undergone changes so profound that looking at your reflection in broken glass or standing water would reveal a stranger whose appearance bore only the faintest resemblance to the person you had been when this nightmare began. Weight loss would have progressed far beyond simple malnutrition into a state of systematic consumption, where your body had begun breaking down muscle tissue and organ function to fuel the basic metabolic processes that kept you technically alive. Your clothes would hang like empty sacks around a frame that had been reduced to little more than skin stretched over bones that seemed to grow more prominent with each passing day. The skin that remained would tell its own story of prolonged suffering through a catalogue of wounds, infections, and discolorations that mapped your journey through this contaminated wasteland. Cuts that should have healed weeks ago would remain open and weeping, while bruises would have taken on permanent purple and yellow hues that indicated your body's complete inability to repair even minor damage. Your face would have become a mask of hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that stared out from dark sockets like windows into an emptiness that reflected the systematic destruction of everything that had once made you recognizably human. The expressions that had once communicated your thoughts and emotions to others would have been replaced by a blank vacancy that suggested consciousness operating at levels barely above complete shutdown. Hair that had once been a source of personal identity would have become brittle and patchy, falling out in clumps that left irregular bald spots across your scalp. What remained would be dull and lifeless, lacking the natural oils and nutrients that had once given it texture and color. Your fingernails would be cracked and broken from constant contact with rough surfaces and contaminated materials, while your hands would bear the accumulated scars of countless small injuries that had never properly healed. The psychological changes would prove even more dramatic than the physical transformation, representing a complete reconstruction of your personality and mental processes in response to circumstances that no amount of previous experience could have prepared you to handle. The person you remembered being before this ordeal would seem like a character from a story you had once read, rather than a previous version of yourself. Values and beliefs that had seemed fundamental to your character would have been systematically abandoned as survival necessities eliminated any practical distinction between actions you would once have considered moral and those you would have found abhorrent. The ethical framework that had guided your previous decisions would exist only as abstract memories that bore no relationship to the choices you now face daily. Social skills that had once enabled you to navigate complex interpersonal relationships would have atrophied through complete disuse, leaving you uncertain about how to interact with other human beings if such an encounter were ever to occur. The subtle cues and behavioral patterns that had once seemed automatic would feel foreign and artificial, like acting techniques you had once learned but could no longer perform convincingly. And so, you've now witnessed the most terrifying truth about human existence that most people never have to confront. Waking up in a plague-ridden town isn't just about disease or death. It's about discovering how fragile everything you consider permanent really is, and how quickly a civilized person can be reduced to something unrecognizable when stripped of everything that makes life worth living. The real horror isn't the corpses or the contamination. It's the realization that all of us are always just one catastrophe away from facing these same impossible choices, the same systematic breakdown of everything we believe about ourselves and our world. This nightmare has played out countless times throughout human history, and it will happen again, because that's the price of being human in a universe that doesn't care about our dreams of safety and permanence.